Good evening. I'm John, and I'm part of the team that gets to enjoy these community Bible studies together with the 4 different groups at Christ Church that are doing this study, along with thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people around the world. More than 1 million people are participating in community Bible study groups all over the world. I don't know if they're all studying John right now. I'm supposed to give a closing talk every week, and I haven't been doing that, but John is a fascinating study, and the groups have been great, and we're learning together. And really keep an eye on how the writer, John, keeps adding more as we're reading and observing and not using a lot of commentaries or things like that, because we just want to grow as a group in how we understand the text and listen to the text. But notice how John began with such an incredible, powerful beginning of the cosmic Christ and the light coming into the darkness and illuminating us and giving us the possibility to be sons and daughters of God, not just human beings, but spiritual beings. And that comes together here in our study from this past week about Nicodemus, when he asks, how can I be part of the kingdom of God? And Jesus says, well, you must be born again. Well, how can I be born again? I can't get back into my mother. And Jesus says, well, you have to be born of water and the Spirit. Now, the question came up as to whether or not Jesus was talking about baptism and the role of baptism in the church and how that's handled. And, excuse me, I just want to point out, number one, that does not appear to be Jesus' meaning in this text, in this context. Nicodemus brings up the idea of going back inside your mother's womb to be born again. And Jesus is calling that being born of water, the natural physical birth that we all experienced that, brought us into this life, as we say. But he says there's more, there's a spiritual rebirth. And if we look back in the text and we see how John was putting together cosmic Christ coming into the world, and then very earthly John the Baptist out in the river in the desert. And so this contrasts. And then Jesus calling his disciples, and Philip and Nathaniel, and he calls them by name, and it's very personal encounters. And at the same time, it's mysterious, divine encounters, because Jesus says, hey, I knew you when you were under the fig tree. There's already been some kind of a connection and a knowing, and they're starting to recognize this guy is the Messiah. He's the promised one, and so they're excited. And Jesus has this amazing miracle, turns the water into wine in a moment of great crisis for a family. He comes in and resolves it. And he goes up to Jerusalem, and we had the whole conversation about his going into Jerusalem and reacting. He was angry as he saw the covetousness, the aggressive greed of the leaders of the temple in turning everything into commerce and taking away from the poor people and taking away from everybody because they had the power to do it. And so an aggressive, covetous, greedy attitude. And Jesus says, the temple was not made for this. It was made for more. They're not just our religious realities, but there are greater spiritual realities, and that's what God is really about. And so he's casting out the tables, and he's turning it over, and just making a dramatic statement. And it's in this context of the purification of the temple that John puts the story of Nicodemus coming and Jesus answering about being born again, being purified, being renewed. And so many churches have put a strong emphasis on baptism, and that's created a lot of confusion down through the centuries. In particular, in the Western world, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, has put an emphasis since, I believe, from the times of Augustine, of the importance, understanding that how sin, he understood, sin is passed on to every human being. Well, how can that be? Well, he decided it must be passed on through our sexual intercourse, and maybe comes through the blood, And so there's different concepts. And so if the sin has already come, then the next thing you have to do is, besides the wrong theology of sex and the subordination of the women, then you get into the idea that the child is a sinner, condemned before God, unless the purifying waters of baptism. And so immediately baptize the baby, and then that becomes essential. And through the years, the traditions, the cultures changed different variations of that. And so the baby baptism, the infant baptism, is for a salvation. I come from a place of understanding, and I stand in a long tradition of other Christians who also believe that God is a God of mercy and of love, and there is no condemnation for anyone for things they didn't even know about. They're not conscious of, they're not aware of. And so children, people who are, mentally incapacitated for some reason, all these kinds of things enter in. And so that kind of thinking says, as a person gets to be an older, mature age, they can make their own decision about baptism, because baptism is a sign of God's grace. It's an outward sign of an inward grace, something that's taking place. So it's a symbol that speaks to us, but it's not essential. And so baptism is important. Christians have always been baptized to say, I identify with, I'm a disciple of this one. Did baptism begin with Jesus and the church? No. Jesus found John already baptizing. Did it begin with John? No. It was a common part of the Jewish religious practice to be baptized, to step in and say, I want to be renewed and refreshed and follow this teaching. I want my spiritual life to grow. And so people were baptized to say, I'm a follower of this individual. And so to be baptized into the Christian church is really to be baptized into saying, I follow Jesus. Churches that say it's about your church membership, or you have to be rebaptized all the time and things like that. It's just, to me, it doesn't make sense. It's an overstatement, so I won't go more into that. But different churches, different traditions, different history, and what kind of emphasis do we allow those to have in our thinking? So, respectfully said, Jesus is talking about there's a greater reality than just this physical reality. And I'm sure John is also putting it together with the miracle of water into wine. We're living in a time right now, the news this week, the violence, the convulsions around the world, it's a scary, uncertain, difficult time. And yet, studying the Gospel of John, working together, reading together, we can be reminded that we have the possibility, through faith in Jesus, to be sons and daughters of God. And ultimately, He will take the dark, swirling waters of that are surrounding us, the darkness, and He will turn it into wine that's giving life to all the party. And so Jesus is real, spiritual life is real, and it's worth having. And it's what puts a smile on our face and allows us to rest at night and know that God ultimately is going to have the last word. May God bless you. And this has been long, and I'm sorry, but I'll see you on Monday.